Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining the National Conference on Race and Ethnicity webinar series. NCORE is part of the Southwest Center for Human Relations Studies at the University of Oklahoma in Norman, Oklahoma. My name is Dedrick Perkins. I am the Senior Program Coordinator. I am very, very delighted to welcome you all here and to be your host this afternoon. Our hope is that we continue the conference tradition of working to improve racial, ethnic, and intercultural relations on college campuses and community organizations by providing this virtual learning platform with opportunities like this one. For those of you joining us for the first time, NCORE has monthly webinars on the first and last Wednesday of each month, with the occasional exceptions like holidays. Some of the webinars are free, and others are offered at a modest fee of $25. Our next webinar is I'm Black Before I'm an Athlete, College Athlete Activist, and Blackness as a Transformational Force. It will be presented on March 8th by Dresden Frazier. So please visit our website for the full list of webinars for this season. Before we get started with our fantastic presentation today, I really want to go over some housekeeping items. First, if you need to utilize closed captioning, make sure your settings are set to on for closed captioning. Always remain muted unless you are asked to be unmuted. We ask that your background has no images or flashing lights, no moving images. Sorry, I have images, but they're not moving. So no moving images or flashing lights. Please report any specific tech, accessibility, or any other operational concerns via a direct message to me, the session host. Also, if you could please save your questions to the end and use the question answer feature at the bottom of the screen, that would be greatly appreciated. We will have a short Q&A session at the end of the session. So if there's any questions that arise during the presentation, please put them in the box to be considered to be looked at the end of the session. So now, please help me welcome today's presenter, Emmanuel Magana from Portland State University.
Hi there, everyone. I appreciate the introduction. Again, my name is Emmanuel Magana. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the Assistant Director for Multicultural Detention Services here at Portland State University. So thank you so much for joining us. Give me 1 second while I get this presentation up. There we go. Awesome. So again, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate y'all presence. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about kind of the intersections between comic book heroes and some social justice themes. But before we begin, I do want to do a land acknowledgement. I am here in Portland, Oregon, and so my land acknowledgement will reflect the land that I am on. So we honor the indigenous people whose traditional and ancestral homelands we stand on, the Multnomah, the Katlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, Walala bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin Kalapuya, and many other indigenous nations of the Columbia River. It is important to acknowledge the ancestors of this place and to recognize they are here because of the sacrifices forced upon them. In remembering these communities, we honor their legacy, their lives, and their descendants. A couple things too I do want to note. This session will cover some sensitive topics. We are going to be talking a little bit about lynching, women's violence, medical experimentation, and police and violence as well. And also one thing I want to note too is this presentation does cover a handful of heroes. You know, I sometimes get people coming like, oh, why didn't you mention this hero or mention this hero, right? So I apologize if I didn't get a chance to highlight maybe your favorite hero or somebody that you think would be really pertinent for this presentation. The other thing I also want to mention too is that especially in kind of the nerd world of geekdom, sometimes there's a little bit of gatekeeping in terms of who knows the most about a certain character and things like that. So I'm hoping that we can kind of just put all that aside and have an opportunity to kind of try to learn something. And again, you know, this was something that for me was done out of fun. You know, I have a high interest in kind of superheroes and nerddom and geekdom, you know, kind of communities. But I don't by all means consider myself to be an expert in all things. And so there might be some hiccups and things that I might have missed, but feel free to maybe bring those up in the Q&A. And I would love to be able to have an opportunity to kind of update or change my presentation as needed. We'll go ahead and begin. So really quickly, I want to do kind of just a quick primer on the idea of social justice. So essentially, to keep it as simple as possible, social justice is really just the concept of fair and just relations between an individual and a society. And sometimes we can think about that or break that into certain type of themes or ideas, such as justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, access, and acceptance. A lot of times it can be easy to think of social justice as in social justice movements. I think oftentimes that's the easiest way to kind of contextualize this idea of social justice. And so we can think back to the civil rights movement as a social justice movement. We can think back to, fighting for workers' rights, especially if you think about like kind of like the Great Boycott in California. And even most recently, the Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter, marriage equity, those type of things can be considered social justice type of movements. This idea of being able to provide fair and equitable options for people in a society. And so the question then becomes, why would I even want to look at this idea of social justice through a superhero lens? Unfortunately, superhero comics have not had the best history when it comes to these type of topics. There's been a lot of racism, misogyny, sexism, and really a lot of unrealistic body standards when it comes to a lot of the comic books from, especially when we look back, and even up to recently, there's some of these things that still come up. So there's some pretty egregious examples that I have on here, right? So we have an old Captain America comic book. It's pretty egregious in the way that it's portrayed. The Japanese, we have a Superman comic that's also portraying our indigenous folks in a very negative light, and especially the misogyny that we see as well too, the way that the women are treated in a lot of these comic books. There's a panel from the Fantastic Four, and so the Fantastic Four have come back, they've come to relax, and they're all kind of chilling on couches, relaxing, and you have the Thing saying, "Oh, this is life, wake me up at Christmas, next Christmas." And then Miss Invisible Woman comes in and says, I think I better do a little house cleaning. And Mr. Fantastic just says, as long as you do it silently. So here's this hero, this group of heroes, and the women's kind of been portrayed as somebody that needs to do the cleaning up around them. This is also a pretty good example of kind of just the violence that's shown against women in comic books. So we have Batgirl. And Batgirl is supposed to be a superhero, right? On par with a lot of the abilities of Batman. Yet she's kind of shown here in a very vulnerable state, being kind of manhandled by the Joker. What's really interesting is this was actually a variant cover for one of her comic books. And so it's interesting to think about that her own comic series, she was being treated kind of violently. And it's supposed to be a callback to an older comic book series where the Joker actually ended up paralyzing her, and it's supposed to be somewhat of a like I said, callback to that. But unfortunately, it's just interesting to think about, again, a comic book that is supposed to be where a woman is the main character and supposed to be the hero, yet they're being kind of depicted as being weak or being kind of vulnerable. Another good example, again, when we think of body proportions and they think about kind of the way that women are also portrayed. On one side, we have a Spider-Man comic book where, he's sitting on a web ball and he's kind of just, kind of perching over it in a way that makes somewhat sense. And then you have kind of a similar type of drawing with Spider-Woman, yet unfortunately she's on the side of a building and her proportions don't make a lot of sense, unfortunately. And so again, you have a lot of examples of comic books kind of, again, just really treating both women violently. There's an expression in the comic book fandom called fridging somebody. And so it goes back to a Green Lantern comic book in which the hero's partner or hero's kind of love interest was murdered and unfortunately kind of stored in a fridge, which is pretty disgusting to think about. And so the hero finds this, and it's the motivation that the hero needs to be able to fight the bad guy or to fight, and so you see this a lot in comic books and a lot in terms of superhero tropes, right? A woman or a female needs to be hurt or killed to be able to give the male some type of motivation to kind of follow through. And so you see this pretty frequently in kind of comic books. So again, why would we use this, right? If comic books have been kind of this history of being kind of both sexist and misogynistic and racist, well, in reality, they actually have a lot of concepts in them that have come up, and a lot of them are products of their time. But even then, as products of their time, there's also a lot of progressive things that were happening, and the creation of some of these heroes, creation of some of these characters were because of some type of progressive things. And so we're going to spend some time talking about those things. We're going to try to pull themes from some famous comic book storylines and highlight a few heroes in the process as well too. And so the first hero I want to highlight is probably considered the first superhero ever created, and that's Superman. And so Superman was created by Joe Shuster and Jerry Siegel, both who came from immigrant Jewish families. And I think it's pretty relevant because a lot of the early stories really reflected kind of that idea of coming from an immigrant background and coming from a family that was new to this country. And you kind of see this reflected in a lot of the early stories of Superman and Superman as a character, kind of this immigrant dream of being able to come to a country and find success and do good. And again, when you think about Superman, it's kind of the epitome of that, right? Coming from someplace different, coming to the United States, coming to Earth and be able to find success and being all powerful and be able to change the things that are wrong. And again, if you think about, again, the background of these creators and thinking of where they come from, being from immigrant backgrounds, coming from low-income households, there was a lot of things that they saw that weren't right, a lot of injustices that they saw. And so for them to be able to create Superman as a character is a way to kind of almost vicariously live through his character to be able to to fix some of those injustices. So again, a lot of his early stories, like I said, reflected that type of ideal. And so because he was a Depression, World War II kind of character, a lot of that reflected that in those early stories. And so this is actually a panel from Action Comics #1, which was Superman's first appearance. And so what's really interesting, again, I think, is that Superman's not going around and like stopping an alien force or not stopping some kind of giant robot or something. He's trying to stop spousal abuse. And so here he is, he goes, hold it, what do you want? Don't get tough. Tough of putting it mildly, the treatment you're going to get, you're not fighting a woman now. And so again, when you think of Superman, you think of him fighting like these grandiose villains, and yet here he's trying to do some more domestic type of things. Here's another great example of Superman trying to fight back on kind of political corruption. And so here he is, he goes, who's behind you in corrupting Senator Barrows? And another character goes, I don't know what you're talking about. And he goes, so you're one of these silent men, huh? We'll see whether you talk. And he goes, let go of my hand. And he goes, your foot will do just as well. So again, trying to fight back on kind of political corruption. And again, the villains during those times were mob bosses, corrupt politicians, businessmen, the Klan. There was actually a whole radio series where Superman actually took on the Klan. And that was actually groundbreaking when you think about that time in that era when the Klan was kind of making a resurgence in some ways. And so here's Superman, they create this radio show, which was very popular at the time, and he takes on the Klan, which was pretty amazing. Nazis, again, anti-Semitism, those were huge factors, type of villains, things that he was trying to take on. I think what's especially fun to think about too is his arch nemesis. So his arch nemesis is Lex Luthor. So Lex Luthor isn't some superpowered being. He's not some alien. He's not some robot. He doesn't have super strength. At the end of the day, Lex Luthor is a businessman. He is a shrewd capitalist, and that's the arch nemesis for Superman. Again, if we think about the origins of Superman, we think about him pushing back on kind of like societal injustices. And if we think about Depression era Superman, the villains were some of these capitalists, they were taking advantage of the working class. And so that's who Superman's arch villain is. Now, you can make the argument that Lex Luthor started off as an evil scientist, and in some ways he still is with modern depictions. But at the end of the day, he's a shrewd business person. He's the head of a major business, LexCorp, which essentially is kind of built up Metropolis. Metropolis is the city that Superman lives in, and a lot of the buildings are because of Lex Luthor. He's helped kind of create it into this shining beacon, so quote unquote. He's known to be very dishonest. He's known for being greedy. He's known for having huge towers in Metropolis with his name on them. And as a character, he actually ran for president, actually won. So, there's some definitely similarities with some real life, politicians that we've had in the past. And then I always kind of just chuckle because I think he looks like Jeff Bezos here, but just my interpretation. So the other thing too to consider is that, if you think about it, Superman is an immigrant. He's not from the United States. He's from the planet Krypton. And not only that, but he's a refugee. His planet was destroyed. His planet no longer exists. He was attempting to escape something, or his family was attempting to give him a better life. Not only that, but he's undocumented and he hides his status. He has a secret identity. For the most part, he's not going around telling people he's Superman. Most depictions of Superman have him with his alter ego, Clark Kent. And so this is a person that came to this country, to try to escape some type of destruction, more or less undocumented, because again, he just landed here. And not only that, but he hides his status. He hides his status as who he is. So Clark Kent is the regular person who works at the Daily Planet, and then there's Superman. Superman is the hero that can do it all. And so it's really interesting to think about it, especially when you think about the origins and the creators of Superman coming from immigrant backgrounds. I think what's also really interesting too is that Superman is known for the saying truth, justice, and the American way. And I love this because kind of really flips that in some ways. And so this was actually not so much a comic book panel, but this was actually taken from from actual book that existed back in the 1970s. It was a part of a book that was sent out to children. And here it is kind of reprinted. And so he's going, and remember, boys and girls, your school, like our country, is made up of Americans of many different races, religions, and national origins. So if you hear anybody talk against the schoolmate or anyone else because of his religion, race, or national origin, don't wait. Tell them that kind of talk is un-American. And so here's Superman trying to kind of take that idea of truth, justice, and the American way and create it in a sense of like, hey, America needs to be a place for inclusivity. America is a place that respects people from all different backgrounds. And that's what makes America, America. And that's kind of his perspective. Again, there are some controversies around that. But at the end of the day, here is Superman, who, again, is an immigrant coming to this country and understands that American can have a lot of different type of people coming into it, a lot of diversity, and he's trying to make the arguments like, hey, we're all American here. It doesn't matter where you're coming from, and that's the argument that he's trying to make here. And so another character at the time when Superman was popular was Wonder Woman. So Wonder Woman was created by William Moulton Marston, who was an accomplished psychologist. And so Wonder Woman was actually inspired by his wife, Elizabeth Marston, and their life partner, Olive Bryant. So William Moulton Marston was actually in a polyamorous relationship. This was like the 1930s. So this was a time when this would have been seen as scandalous and definitely non-traditional. But he considered himself to be an outspoken feminist and advocated for polyamory. And so he lived, like I said, in a relationship with his wife and another partner, and they all lived in the same household. And so, again, it can be said that his inspiration was really from those two women that were in his life. So again, just an advocate for polyamory at a time when, again, this wasn't something that was really talked about. And again, so, as time went on, Wonder Woman really became a huge, feminist icon. And so when she first debuted, she was really just kind of depicted as fighting Nazis in World War II. But what was really amazing is that she really pushed back on this damsel in distress trope. So if you go to Superman, he was always trying to save Lois Lane. Lois Lane was always in some kind of trouble or something, and he always had to come in and save the day. Whereas, Wonder Woman could save herself. That was kind of the idea. What was cool is that she was also a trained warrior and a diplomat. And so really writing a character that was, again, non-traditional for his time. A woman, a character that was strong, that was intelligent, and so it was pretty, impactful at this time. So, and not only that, but they came from a matriarchal society. So Wonder Woman comes from this island that is ruled by women, and it's a women-only society. And this is where she kind of learns to be a diplomat, learns to kind of be a warrior, and this is where she learns these things. And as time went on, unfortunately, she did start to suffer from some of the superhero tropes of having to be saved and having other characters. And she almost kind of went away for a little bit, but she actually ended up coming back strong during second wave feminism as a feminist icon. And it kind of brought her back and, kind of pushing to kind of bring strong female characters in the comic book world. And to the point now where she's considered what's called part of the DC Trinity. And so there's these three characters in DC in which a lot of stories tend to revolve around, are the three big heavy hitters, and that's Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman. And again, in a comic book world, mostly it's mostly dominated by male superheroes. And here you have this woman right there sitting with the two biggest heroes in the DC universe. And so I want to talk about the X-Men. And so the X-Men are a superhero group. They're known as mutants, which means that they are born with their powers. And so these powers tend to manifest during puberty, although some are born immediately with the mutation. But basically they're a superhero team led by somebody named Professor X, which I'm going to talk about here in a second. And essentially they kind of save the world, to put it mildly. But what does that mean? And so, excuse me, the X-Men were created by both Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. Both who also came from immigrant Jewish backgrounds. And as I kind of mentioned before, this is a team book. characters were born with powers. And so as kind of Stan Lee has mentioned that, one of the hardest parts of writing superheroes was always trying to find a reason as to why they got their superpowers. And so to kind of solve this issue, he was kind of like, they're born with it, that's what they have, and this is what's going to, happen with these characters. And kind of over time, it sort of became an allegory to the civil rights movement. Stan Lee kind of talks about how it wasn't my intention to write an allegory for the civil rights movement, but that's eventually kind of what it became. And as time went on, the teams became more and more diverse. The original 5 were, 4 men, 1 woman coming from just kind of American white backgrounds. But as the team went on, we started to see a little bit more diversity in the team, especially as kind of like the 70s rolled around, becoming more of an international team as well, bringing in characters from different countries and different backgrounds. And really diversity, I think, is what is where the X-Men really shine in terms of bringing a lot of different backgrounds into one team. So I also want to take time to highlight Chris Claremont. And so he wrote the X-Men from 1975 until 1991, and really kind of made the X-Men cool. And what I mean by that is that previously, they were a team book, and it was kind of aimed at, teenagers, just like a lot of the comics at that time. And most of it was kind of cheesy and corny, kind of cornball stuff, right? It wasn't until Chris Claremont started writing them that a lot of kind of the social issues that we think about or associate with the X-Men really started coming at the forefront. Not only that, but he started to introduce a lot of strong female characters as part of writing the X-Men. And so, which is mainly a male-dominated group, he started featuring other, characters that come from diverse backgrounds, and started introducing really strong, powerful women as part of the team as well. So as I mentioned before, the leader of the X-Men is Professor X, and now the arch nemesis of the X-Men is Magneto. However, we can also see kind of the real-life comparison to other civil rights leaders, specifically Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. And so if you think about Professor X, he strongly believes in a world where mutants and humans can live together in coexistence, that they can live and work with one another. If you were to think about it, he's in many ways the classic liberal trying to appeal to reform and change. He believes, hey, there's a lot of injustices and we need to go into the system and we need to change that. We need to work with the system to make those changes. Whereas Magneto, he tends to think of mutants more as a victim of oppression and violence. And he believes that completely destroying the systems of power. He believes in mutant liberation. And so that mutants need to be able to fight back and create their own society to be able to kind of have more self-determination in their future. And so again, you kind of see some of those allegories within the ideology or rhetoric of some early MLK, Malcolm X writings, where again, Malcolm X was very much, you think about classic MLK, you think about, living in an equal society where everyone works together. And you think about, classic Malcolm X is like, no, we need to do our own type of thing. Granted, their ideologies started kind of converging as time went on, but again, you kind of see the allegories, the similarities between Professor X and Magneto and MLK and Malcolm X. And so again, the X-Men really highlighted a lot of social issues. They touched on racism, anti-Semitism, really touched on LGBTQ themes, religion, apartheid, genocide. The way they kind of positioned the X-Men was that they're mutants, and mutants are the victims of systems of oppression. They are systemically being oppressed. And so I have some cool images here to kind of bring that home that, but some of the storylines, for example, Magneto identifies as Jewish coming from a concentration camp. And that's where kind of a lot of the ideology from Magneto comes from. You also have one of the very first LGBTQ weddings that ever happened in comic book history was in an X-Men comic book. And then again, they have what's interesting too is that mutants usually when they hit puberty, as I mentioned before, that's usually when a lot of their powers manifest. And so sometimes in the comic book, they've kind of taken this idea of like, okay, now I have to explain these powers to my parents. And it, again, functions very similar to, in some ways, to a coming out process for people that identify as LGBTQ. So I'm going to show a little clip here that kind of highlights that.
So, when did you first know you were
a mutant?
But you cut that out.
You have to understand, we thought Bobby was going to a school for the gifted.
Bobby is gifted.
We know that. We just didn't realize he
We
was...
still love you, Bobby. It's just this mutant problem is a little...
What mutant problem?
complicated.
What exactly are you a professor of, Mr. Logan?
Art.
Well, you should see what Bobby can do.
I can do a lot more than that.
Ronnie?
This is all my fault.
Actually, they discovered that males are the ones who carry the mutant gene and pass it on, so it's his fault.
Again, I think that video clip does a great job of kind of showing that, hey, you know, as a mutant, they now have to kind of confront the parents about these things. And sometimes the parents can be accepting, sometimes not. Sometimes family members can be accepting and some cannot. And so it's having that discussion, it's, again, similar, that kind of mirrors in some ways the coming out process. So I want to highlight a few stories too as well that kind of really push home some of these themes. So there's this famous storyline called God Loves, Man Kills, which was written by Chris Claremont in 1982. So essentially what the story is about is you have this villain named Reverend Stryker. And so he is essentially feels that mutants are some kind of abomination. And so he is a reverend and he leads this group called the Purifiers. And so he sets it upon himself to kind of destroy mutants, or again, kind of raise awareness of how they are abominations. And so, you know, throughout the comic, you know, there's themes of discrimination, scenes of lynching, use of hate language. You see political heads kind of talking on TV about the mutant problem, and also being, religion being used as a tool to harm as well. So I kind of want to highlight some of these comic book panels. And so here you have two young Black children trying to run away from something. And unfortunately, you see one of them actually get hit in the back. And so again, if we think about the kind of, we're thinking about today, we can kind of see the allegories or the similarities to kind of the violence against young Black youth, and how a lot of our Black youth are unfortunately getting killed when they're trying to kind of almost just defend themselves or just live, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in some other heroes as well too. And so these two characters, they're trying to run away. One of them gets in the back. And so they're basically telling them like, hey, we're here to catch you, capture you. And it's a little sad, right? Because, as the comic panel goes on, they end up kind of, killing these kids, and, they hang them up, and, they put signs on them that say mutie, which again, really reflects kind of historical examples of lynching. Another great panel is you have Professor X and William Stryker on TV. They're discussing the quote unquote mutant problem. And so Professor X, he's kind of saying mutants per se are not a monolithic group possessing one set of attitudes or goals. Excuse me, they're individuals. And as are we all, it should be judged as such. And so William Stryker goes, and there you go, Charles. These individuals of you possess some pretty terrifying powers. How are we to come and folk to defend ourselves against them? If I may quote from the report, Senator Robert Kelly's ad hoc committee on mutant activities, the ever-increasing number of mutants pose a clear and present danger both to the United States and to the socio-political order of the world as we know it. And so the X-Men are there, they're watching it as well. And what's really interesting is that you kind of have the crew in the back who are kind of directing it. And you have them saying, Q on camera 1, you think Xavier's making a convincing case? Yeah, but who's listening? Stryker knows television, and he's playing to the audience. He comes across as such a nice, personable guy. Too bad, because the man's message is pretty damn scary. And so again, thinking about when this was written, 1982, and we can kind of almost come to kind of some modern depictions.
Thousands of criminal aliens
pouring into our country.
They're not people. These are animals.
Our country will be overrun.
Take a look at the death and destruction that's been caused by people coming into this country. The death and destruction caused by people that shouldn't be here.
These are animals. They're coming into our country.
They're not people. These are animals.
They're animals.
What was the name? Animals. Otherwise, you have millions and millions of people pouring into our country. So the Democrats want open borders. Let everybody come in. Let everybody pour in. You'd have millions of people pouring through our border. People pouring into our country. I'm angry when people pour.
All right, so hopefully that kind of drives home the message. We have another great panel here. And here is Reverend Stryker talking to his followers. He goes, "Are we not to let those who put forward the proposition that we are descendant from apes tell us that our descendants, our children, will be born monsters and that this is natural? I say no, I say never. We are as God made us. Any deviation from that sacred template, any mutation comes not from heaven, but hell." So again, using religion as a way to kind of harm and destroy. And again, we've seen this before. Previous president using kind of religion as a way to kind of stoke violence and hate amongst other groups. Another great example, and I won't show the meme, I'll show this part first. But again, you see Reverend Stryker kind of pointing at one of the characters, Nightcrawler, saying, "Human, you dare call that thing human?" And so I always just kind of chuckle because, the way that Stryker looks, he looked a little bit Mike Pence, which I always thought was kind of a little bit of a funny coincidence. And so I also want to highlight the island nation of Genosha. And so in the X-Men world, Genosha is a small island off the eastern coast of Africa. And it's kind of used as an allegory for South Africa and apartheid in South Africa. And so on this island, it's this kind of prosperous island. And it's prosperous because of the way that mutants are treated. Mutants are considered slaves. They are property of the state. And so they're used as slave labor for free work, to basically prop up the economy. And that's what Genosha basically is. And so eventually, the X-Men and a group of other X teams come in and kind of help kind of start some type of liberation in Genosha. Eventually, Magneto does become the leader of this country over time, and he sets it up as kind of a refuge. And so the idea that any mutant across the world can come to Genosha, and it can be their own society and their own place where they can get along and they can find prosper and not have to be discriminated against or feel persecuted against. And again, if you think about that, we can think about this kind of Marcus Garvey's Back to Africa movement, thinking of its kind of similarities to that. However, unfortunately, the island ends up becoming decimated. And so, 16 million mutants are basically destroyed by Sentinels, which I'll talk about here in a second what Sentinels are. But essentially you have this prosperous country with mutants, and it essentially gets destroyed, killing 16 million mutants in an act of genocide, essentially. And so we kind of see some of the destruction that's happening here in terms of the island kind of being destroyed. We see some of the depictions of the X-Men being kind of captured and strung up, unfortunately. And then we have Magneto kind of pontificating about the island. And so he's talking about some of the devastation, the capital city of Genosha, which is Hammer Bay, formerly a technological marvel without peer. For months, it has been torn apart by the furious civil war between the human ruling class and its mutate slave caste. And so this is shortly before the island was kind of more or less liberated, if that makes sense. And so eventually Magneto does become leader, and then unfortunately we see it get destroyed, which again kind of mirrors a lot of other organizations that kind of gain some power, and the government comes in, kind of infiltrates it and kind of destroys that. Sentinels. So Sentinels are giant robot villains for the X-Men. Essentially, their job is to kind of hunt, capture, and destroy mutants. Somewhat of kind of like if you think about it, almost like a police force. And so certain characters, certain governments have used Sentinels as a way of kind of rounding out mutants, as a way of kind of keeping them in line, making sure that they don't get kind of, I guess, quote unquote, out of hand, however they may be. And so really, they're kind of used as tools of the state to kind of uphold their control. And so if we think about kind of allegories, right, we can think of our modern day police forces and the way that a lot of them are used to kind of put down kind of protests and demonstrations, things like that. And we can even just kind of see the similarities in the way they kind of look, right? So you have the Sentinels here, robotic, faceless kind of almost. And then if you look at kind of some of our police forces, you can kind of see the same thing, right? Kind of some similar motifs there, right? And so again, the Sentinels are used to kind of terrorize the mutant community. And unfortunately, in a lot of communities, police forces terrorize communities of color. And so we can kind of see that similarity there. I also want to touch on the Morlocks. And so, we talk about the X-Men, and I think it's really easy to kind of, when we think about humans and think about the X-Men, we can think about them as these amazing heroes, and they're all super strong, and they have amazing powers. They can do some amazing things, right? But the thing with the mutants is that not every mutant is an X-Men. And so there's still a whole group of mutants that don't have access to the same thing that the X-Men do. So the X-Men live in a mansion. They essentially have all of their needs met. They don't have to worry about rent, or they don't have to worry about finding food. Living in a mansion comes with some pretty great perks, but there's still a whole group of other mutants that don't have that same access to those things. And so the Morlocks is a really great way of thinking about kind of, when we think about almost lookism or the body acceptance in certain BIPOC communities, or even colorism, if we think about it. And so we look at Cyclops over here, and, handsome young man, looks very, very buff. His hair is kind of, swaying, right? And then you have Leech on the right, and Leech is kind of this green-skinned, character with large white or yellow eyes, depending on the artist. And he can't blend into society as well. He can't hide his mutantdom, right? Whereas Cyclops, he puts a pair of glasses on and he can easily just, go into regular society. Leech cannot. And that's kind of the idea behind the Morlocks. So the Morlocks, their mutations keep them from being able to integrate society very easily. And so they don't have access to some of the privileges that some of the X-Men or any other mutants have. And again, some mutants, their powers don't manifest until they are hit puberty. Whereas for some mutants, they're kind of just born looking a little bit different. And so they have to deal with the discrimination basically from the start of their life, as opposed to maybe some mutants that don't have to deal with that till later on in life. And so again, really thinking about the way that, again, we think about colorism, we think about, body acceptance, those type of things. Whereas, I identify as Latino, I have a bit little lighter skin, so I can navigate the world a little bit easier compared to maybe other family or friends that I have who have darker skin and maybe might face more discrimination or oppression, prejudice than I would. And so one of the things that comes up frequently too is that, why is it that the X-Men are hated? How come all other superheroes aren't hated just as much as the X-Men, right? Because, the X-Men have powers, right? But so do the Avengers, and so do the Fantastic Four, and so do these other superhero teams. And how come nobody's like putting up laws and sending sentinels after them, or, creating islands to use them as slave labor? Why is it that the mutants are constantly being, oppressed, and they're the bad guys? And so if we think about it, actually kind of parallels the way we think of kind of oppressed groups. And so, you have oppressed groups that don't have access to the same privileges, same luxuries as other people, but there are still people within those oppressed groups that can still access those things for multiple reasons, whether they be upholding kind of like those systems of oppression, maybe because they can easily navigate those areas. And again, we can think about, like I said, modern depictions. And so a couple of years ago, with Kanye West kind of providing support for Donald Trump, and Kanye West being a Black male and still having to deal with the present nature of that, but still using his status to be able to kind of try to elevate somebody that could directly harm his community. And again, I just like these panels too, because, it shows the Avengers on Late Night with David Letterman. And what I think is interesting is that you have this character Beast, who's also an X-Men, but once he affiliates himself with the Avengers, all of a sudden he gets to be a hero. And again, you have like a press day with the Avengers over here on the left. The X-Men don't get that. The X-Men aren't being, they don't have a press day. They don't get the opportunity to kind of show off their mansion to people. And so it's a really cool video that kind of highlights this I want to show as well.
Hi Scott. For my money, to find out why mutants are discriminated against, we just need to ask, why are real-life minority groups discriminated against? Philosopher Falguni Sheth says it's because they are, or are just seen as, unruly. The unruly is that which is unpredictable, undependable, or threatening to a political order. It's that which is seen as challenging power, or the basic assumptions that power makes. Liberal power likes to assume that all citizens are equal, so insofar as mutants are victims of systemic discrimination and aren't quiet about it, their existence presents a challenge to that assumption. People like to assume that everything is fine, and when you say, actually, no, there are big systemic problems that you may be contributing to, Well, we've seen real-life activist groups get pushed back for that. If you try and have a conversation about the unfair distribution of power and capital, people often misinterpret that as, wait, are you saying that makes me personally a bad person? Even though that's not what systemic discrimination is about. Mutants can also literally challenge power a lot easier than humans can. Remember at the end of X2, where the X-Men just walked right into the Oval Office? You can't hide behind a bureaucratic or political structure to avoid direct accountability to mutants. Their ability to stage protest against power is much greater than any humans. Insofar as mutants can be difficult to kill and sometimes destructive, they also take away some of the power that the state likes to reserve for itself. The ability to attack an enemy and then be free of reprisal is something that governments like to maintain a monopoly on with militaries and police forces. So mutants present a challenge to the government's monopoly on violence. But one thing you'll notice I haven't mentioned is fear. Over on my channel, Philosophy Tube, we're talking about whether discrimination against mutants really does come from a place of fear. And if it doesn't, what that might say about whether a certain revolutionary mutant could be right.
Seriously, go check out all
So yeah, I think that is a good job of kind of summarizing those kind of issues in terms of why are the X-Men hated, but maybe other superheroes aren't. So I want to spend some time talking about Captain America. And so a lot of times people would think, well, Captain America, what's that got to do with social justice? He's, America, rah, rah, rah. But again, if you look at the origins of Captain America and some of the themes, you start to see some kind of social justice things starting coming out of that. And so Captain America originally was created by Jack Kirby and Joe Simon. And really, they created it as a political creation. And so they were really repulsed by the actions of the Nazis. And so this is probably one of the most famous comic book covers in comic book history. You have Captain America punching out Hitler. What people don't realize is this was actually 9 months before Pearl Harbor. And so 9 months before the United States actually entered World War II, you have a character punching out Hitler, which again was a political statement. And at that time, there was actually Nazi rallies happening in Madison Square Garden. There was this kind of idea that maybe, hey, this maybe is not so bad type of thing. And they were kind of really repulsed, the creators. And so they wanted to create a character that was going to go and fight them. And not only that, but he was created kind of as the antithesis of the Aryan Uberman, right? And so if you think about this Uberman ideal, right, this German Uberman that was, tall, blonde hair, blue eyes, and that's Captain America. But guess what? He's not fighting for the Third Reich or Aryan supremacy. He's fighting against what he feels is injustice. And again, his character, while never being overtly political, he did push back on fascism and American first attitudes. And there was a time when he was so disgusted of the actions of the United States that he actually took on the name Nomad, because he was just so disillusioned with what was going on with the country at the time. But there's some really cool comments to kind of highlight some of this pushback against fascism in America first. And so here is kind of Captain America. He's on the ropes against this villain, and he's talking to this person saying, patriotism taken too far is fanaticism, no matter who you are or where you're from. And then the character, the villain, goes, these filthy foreigners made us look bad. Foreigners aren't your enemy, son. I'm the son of immigrants. He goes, what? And then when I was a kid, it was my father's people, Irish, who were looked down on, called filthy foreigners, discriminated against. Is that the xenophobic America you want? All religions, all nationalities, we all want the same thing, to see our children grow strong, to provide safety for our families, to live in quiet times. Peace, son. Isn't that why we became soldiers, to fight for a peaceful world? And again, another great comic that came out in the 70s. So he goes, listen to me, all of you out there. You were told by this man, your hero, that America is the greatest country in the world. He told you that Americans were the greatest people, that America could be refined like silver, could have the impurities hammered out of it and shine more brightly. He went on about how precious America was, how you needed to make sure it remained great, which I think is pretty telling, considering previous presidential slogan. And he told you anything was justified to preserve that great treasure, that pearl of great price that is America. Well, I say America is nothing without its ideals, its commitment to the freedom of all men. America is a piece of trash. A nation is nothing, a flag is a piece of cloth. I fought Adolf Hitler not because America was great, but because it was fragile. I knew that liberty could as easily be snuffed out here as in Nazi Germany. As a people, we are no different from them. When I returned, I saw that you nearly did turn America into nothing. And that the only reason you are not less than nothing is that it's still possible for you to bring freedom back to America. I just love that panel because, he's going on about hey, there's this idea that America is great and we need to keep it great. But he's arguing like, no, America is not great. It is fragile. And we need to uphold our commitments to, justice and equity in these things if we want to make sure we keep it a great place to stay. So here's another good example too. And so Captain America barges into this general and he goes, General, who's this man? He says, Captain, pleasure to see you, pleasure. Oh, that's nonsense. I'm afraid you're not cleared for that, Captain, but it's nothing to, how these things, I really wish I could tell you, Captain, then, it's nothing to, I wish I could. The department holds you in the highest regard. You've always valued your commitment and your loyalty. And he goes, I'm loyal to nothing, General, except the dream. And so this American ideal, American dream idealism that he's loyal to. But I also wanted to highlight Isaiah Bradley, who in the comics is kind of known as the Black Captain America. And so Isaiah Bradley, so Captain America, he's a product of something called the super soldier serum. And so he took this serum to basically create him into a superhero, gave him peak human abilities to be able to jump higher, run faster, do all these amazing things. And so when he fought in World War II, he disappeared, he was frozen. And so the US government was still trying to attempt to recreate this formula. And so they were experimenting on lots of different soldiers to try to recreate this. And so Isaiah Bradley was one of 300 Black soldiers that were forcibly experimented on to try to find a way to kind of reproduce the super soldier serum. And so he actually fled to Europe to fight and don the Cap costume. And at the end of the war, upon his return, he was jailed. And so his legacy in a lot of ways was actually covered up in the comic books. And so within comic book universe, his legacy was covered up. And so here you have this Black hero who was doing some amazing things, and unfortunately his legacy was covered up. And so we have a cool clip here from Falcon and the Winter Soldier that kind of talks about some of these things.
That what I think it is? Leave it covered. Those stars and stripes don't mean nothing good to me.
I need to understand.
You understand. Every Black man does. Whether you want to deny it or not.
Don't do that bitter old man thing with me.
If you ain't bitter, you're blind.
I don't get it, okay? What went wrong? But you were a super soldier like Steve. You could have been the next...
The next? What? Huh? Blonde hair, blue eyes, stars and stripes. The entire world's been chasing that great white hope since he first got dosed with that serum.
Steve did not put you in jail.
You wanted to know what went wrong? A handful of us got shot up with different versions of that serum. But they don't tell us what it is. They tell us it's tetanus. They sent us on missions, even though the others weren't stable. Some of us started dying off. Then a couple of the boys get captured on a mission. I heard the brass talking about blowing the POW camp to hell to hide the evidence. But those are my men, my brothers, not evidence. So I bust out of the facility one night, and I brought them boys back. Not that it made a damn bit of difference. It wasn't long before it was only me left. And what did I get for saving their lives? For the next 30 years, they experimented on me, trying to figure out why the serum worked.
But the world's different now. I know people.
Man, that's why you're here. You think things are different? You think times are different? You think I wouldn't be dead in a day if you brought me out? You want to believe jail was my fault? because you got that white man's shield. Pledge allegiance to that, my brother. They will never let a black man be Captain America. And even if they did, no self-respecting black man would ever want to be.
You know, one thing to highlight there is he talks about how he was experimented on for 30 years, which is about the length of the Tuskegee syphilis study. So we can kind of see the similarities that are happening there. But what's kind of fun too to think about Isaiah Bradley is that while he's not in comic book universe, he's not a widely known character, but within the Black community, he's a widely known character. And so for the Black community in the comic book universe, he is this hero, he's their hero. And so there's a moment in one of the comic book storylines where Cap is learning about this, and it's his first time learning about this, and he's in awe about how this hero could have existed. He never knew about it, but somehow to a whole community, he was one of the main heroes for them. And so he's in awe of it. And so like, this is one of the last panels in terms of the storyline. It shows kind of some of the famous people that cross paths with Isaiah Bradley, at least in the comic book storyline. And so, you know, he kind of mentions that they will never let a Black man be Captain America. And so that brings us to Sam Wilson, Captain America. So at one point, Sam Wilson actually dons the Captain America moniker. And so the mantle was passed on to Captain America. And what's really interesting, he kind of, as Sam Wilson, he addressed some of the apolitical things that were going on with Captain America. And so he decided to take a side. You know, he wasn't going to just kind of stand by, and, you know, he had an opinion and he was going to make it known. And after a while, those ambitions actually put him with odds with Steve Rogers. And so there's some really cool panels that I want to highlight. And so, you know, Captain America, he's talking about how, you know, there's red and blue, black and white, Republican and Democrat, North and South, and it feels like they're just not trusting each other. You know, there's things happening on the streets, and he's talking about he even, you know, and even that's not so simple anymore. The good guys, SHIELD and the NSA are getting caught doing things we never dreamt the bad guys would do, even in our worst nightmares. And so he goes on and he says, you know what, I have a side. That's right. I have opinions, strongly held beliefs even. And here's the thing. The more I saw the people I believed I was standing up for being walked on, the more I heard a noise machine exploiting intolerance and fear, drowning out common sense out, common sense out. The more I wondered, shouldn't Captain America be more than just a symbol? Steve always tried to stay above the fray, and I respected him for it. He took a stand when he had to, but as far as politics went, he played it close to the chest, close to the vest. But if I really believed I could make a difference, if I really believed I could change some minds, do some good, then wasn't I obligated to try? And so again, you know, as a Black man, he sees the world in a different way. And so he has an opinion. Those things are impacting him. And so he comes out with an opinion and he gets blasted for it. You know, Captain America goes partisan, Cap versus the Constitution, Sam Wilson, Captain Anti-America, Captain America approval rating plummets under 50%. Senator calls on Captain America to resign. Sam Wilson, hand in your shield. And so he has an opinion, you know, he decides to say it. He has a side and he gets eviscerated for it, which is really interesting because it happened in comic book universe. And then I want to show this video that kind of shows how it happened in real life.
All right, we have news from the comic book world, and we're going to let the expert on this subject take it away. Clayton, what's going on?
Well, you know, comic books have been struggling over the past few years, Tucker, because more and more Americans are going to see movies. They're going to Marvel movies, of course, to see the Avengers, and so comic books have been struggling to get readership. And here you have Marvel doing a little bit of a PR stunt. In fact, they've made Sam Wilson, who was formerly the Falcon, he's an African American. He's taking over as Captain America now. But he's got a new odd enemy. Instead of going against Hydra and the typical Captain America villains, he's going up against conservatives. That's his new enemy.
And here's a quote from the book of the series. Attention, all trespassers. I am the supreme serpent. By invading this sovereign land, you defy the laws of God, nature, and the United States Constitution. Therefore, I hereby apprehend you by the power vested in me by the aforementioned God, nature, etc., etc.
So who is this serpent? Is this serpent an Islamic extremism, an ISIS member bent on destroying Western civilization? No. The serpent is an American who has misgivings about unlimited illegal immigration and the costs associated with it.
Right.
And that, according to the comic book, is evil.
Right, so these serpents are stopping people from coming over the border, and Captain America's saying, that's not going to happen on my watch. I'm Captain America. Here's what the comic book goes on to say. Oh, I believe you, sir. I can see you have enough trouble with you already. Trouble and disease and crime weigh heavy on your backs.
Interesting.
Of course, an interesting discussion around the idea of disease and rapists and everything else.
But the whole theme is the same, which is out there in the middle of the country between Malibu and Georgetown, everyone is an ignorant, snake-handling bigot, and they need to be held in place or else they'll turn this into Nazi Germany. It's like the people who run this country, a lot of them actually believe that. I live near them. They really think that.
They should do a comic book on the opposite with the people who are working the border to keep us safe.
Well, what about back in the day when these comic books, Captain America used to be punching Hitler in the face? That was the front page of a Captain America comic book back during World War II.
And now the threat comes from ordinary Americans. Probably some of you watching at home. They think you're dangerous.
Keep politics out of comic books. That's what I say.
So I actually want to show some of those panels if we can, because it just kind of cracks me up when they say keep politics out of comics, and then he talks about punching Hitler in the face. There's some discrepancy there, which I think is kind of funny. So the actual comics, show immigrants trying to cross into the border, and they come across this cache of water, and they're kind of like, oh, where does this come from? Oh, it must be Samaritans that are there, and it turns out it's a trap by these villains, the Serpent Society. And so again, kind of reiterating what was said in the video, attention all trespassers, I am the Supreme Serpent. By invading this foreign land, you defy the laws of God, nature, and the United States Constitution. Therefore, I hereby apprehend you by the power vested in me, by the aforementioned God, nature, etc., etc. And then obviously, these immigrants are kind of pleading, saying like, no, leave us alone. And then going on, this is something that I cannot abide by. And so again, just kind of showing, the kind of violence against or destruction against kind of immigrant populations. So here comes Cap. And I think this is kind of funny. They go, well, look who it is, y'all. Captain Socialism is here to save the day. So I think that's kind of a funny remark that they're trying to make on Captain America for expressing his opinions. And so if he goes, if you're done threatening a bunch of unarmed folks, mostly women and children with those things, I'd pack up the pickup and head home if I were gentlemen. And so he's basically trying to defend kind of these, people who are helpless, unfortunately. They're trying to come and make a better life for themselves. And, he is trying to fight back against people who have weapons, guns, and are just looking to kind of harm other people. Yet for some reason, the video over there tries to paint him, Captain America, as the bad guy in this situation for trying to help a vulnerable community. What I think is interesting too, he's kind of having issues with, Steve Rogers. And so, he's going, we've always been miles apart because Steve believes in his heart. Because Steve Rogers in his heart believes that when the chips are down, when its values are at stake, his country will do what's right. And he goes on to say, in my heart, I can only hope it will. And so again, I think that's the kind of different viewpoints. And so you have Steve Rogers, who firmly believes in the nature of being an American and always doing what's right. And Sam Wilson, on the other hand, hopes that the country will do right. And I think that really speaks to the different experiences that they have. Oops. So I want to touch on Black Panther too as well. And so this is a character created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. And it was actually created specifically to address the lack of Black characters in comic books. So Jack Kirby, there's a quote from him talking about how he would walk around in New York, which was Marvel Comics was located in New York. And, he would run into a lot of diversity and a lot of different languages and things. And this was, 1960s, 1950s, right? And he was saying that the comic books weren't reflecting where he was living at. Now, the language he used was very reminiscent of the time, fortunately, but he wanted to create a character that really spoke to what he was seeing there in New York. And so it was the first major comic to feature an all-Black cast, and Black Panther is this king in the nation of Wakanda. And so one of the first artists, and what's considered almost the definitive Black Panther artist, is actually Billy Graham. And so he was one of actually the few and first Black artists with Marvel during this time. And so at a time when all of Marvel was mostly white males, you had this artist, Billy Graham, who was there, who was kind of pushing this character forward. He also ended up being part of the creative team that developed Luke Cage, which I'm going to talk about here in a second. And so as I mentioned before, Wakanda. And so Wakanda is this futuristic country that mixes both science and mysticism. And Black Panther T'Challa, he is the king of Wakanda. He kind of oversees in his country. And so what's awesome is it's just a country that's never been colonized or conquered. It's rich in resources known as vibranium. So vibranium is this kind of metal that you can do a lot of really cool, interesting things with. And that's what kind of creates a futuristic society that they live in. And it really kind of speaks to the richness of resources and cultural traditions that Africa actually has. And so Africa is filled with resources. It's filled with, a lot of historical traditions. Yet a lot of times we never got a chance to kind of see what that's like because of colonization, because of oppression. A lot of these countries never got to see their potential. Whereas Wakanda would be like, hey, what if this country was never colonized, never conquered, got the opportunity to actually use their resources to not only help people, but also create a futuristic society. And so that's what kind of Wakanda is, really kind of blends this idea of Afrofuturism and also just being a place where, people can thrive, a community can thrive. And I think one of the things I love about Black Panther in some ways, because he's a king, he's a king of an African nation, a continent that's been subject to brutal colonization, he has a really kind of different viewpoint on kind of the superhero community. And so a lot of times he can sometimes be thought of as a foil to maybe some other heroes, and sometimes pushes back on the superhero community. And so here's a great panel, right, where some of the major superheroes are trying to come together and form a group called the Illuminati. If you saw the Doctor Strange movie, you might be a little familiar with this. But basically, it's a group of kind of heavy hitter superheroes that want to come together and kind of try to dictate kind of how things go, or at least inform each other of what's going on so they can kind of help one another, supposedly. And T'Challa goes in there, he's invited because he's the king of Wakanda. And they're telling him, he's basically saying, like, I'm telling you now, and this, walk away from this table and go home. There's a reason the Skrulls had such an easy time trying to turn the world against its heroes, because deep down, everyone knows that this could happen, and now it has. You've just decided all by yourselves that you are the Earth's protectors, and that you, and only you, not your teammates or family, are trustworthy enough to include in this process. What happens when you disagree? When one of these earth-changing moments finds you all at odds with each other here in a secret meeting, what happens then? And so the idea was this Illuminati would meet in secret. They would meet so that, nobody can kind of influence them. But he's basically pushing back and saying, like, who gave you the opportunity to do this? Who gave you the right to do this? And, if you look at most of the characters in Illuminati, they're mainly white men. And so he's kind of pushing back on that, saying, like, why do you get to decide what happens? And why are you doing it in secret? This is going to end badly for you. Another one of my favorite comic books or comic panels is you have Tony Stark here. And he's trying to create this device to stop this character. And so he goes, well, assuming we can get even these 5 Phoenix out of the X-Men in the same physical space as the suit, that there's 13% chance of it actually redirecting the energy from where it came from. And yeah, pretty much 100% chance of it killing the suit's pilot either way. And so he goes, look, T'Challa, this is my fault. I was the guy that ran hawk-hawked and created this problem. If fixing it means a one-way ticket, then I've earned it. And so what's Black Panther do? He smacks the crap out of him. And I love this because here you have Tony Stark trying to say, hey, I'm going to try to create this thing. If it doesn't work, well, I guess that sucks. I have to die. And if that means me dying, so be it. And Black Panther smacks the crap out of him. He says, science is failing us, and you're concerned with writing your own ending. That is unacceptable as your precious little 13%. Science fails, you have failed. You don't get to kill yourself to escape finding a solution. And I love this because, again, he's just pushing back on this kind of like white savior type of idea. And so here you have Iron Man, who's, the hero. He's used to being the hero, and he's going to go out in a blaze of glory. And guess what? It doesn't matter what happens after the fact, because he went out looking like a hero. And Black Panther's like, no, you don't get to leave us with your mess. We just need to work a little harder. And it's not fair that you're doing this to us. So I love that. He's critiquing kind of this idea of what it means to be your hero. So I want to take some time to also highlight Luke Cage. And so what I love about Luke Cage is that this is a hero that was created to kind of be a hero for like the hood, a hero for the streets. And so he was created mainly due to the popularization of the blaxploitation genre. And so this was a character who was initially framed, went to prison, did his time, was experimented on while in prison. And through these experiments, he ended up with bulletproof skin. And so, if you think about Luke Cage, his powers really speak to kind of a BIPOC experience. This idea of being powerless, being in a neighborhood that maybe does not have the resources that other neighborhoods have, and wishing you can make some kind of difference. And here Luke Cage comes around and says, hey, I got bulletproof skin, I can do things, I can change it, and I can help people around in our community. And that's kind of what the idea behind Luke Cage was, is helping those people in his community. He was known as the hero for hire initially, so he would get hired to go do hero things. Most of the times he wouldn't accept money at the end of it. And again, speaking to this idea of being a Black man with bulletproof skin, I think it's pretty powerful to be able to come into a community and say, hey, I don't have to worry about this violence from police brutality. That I don't have to, that's not something that has to concern me. And I can be a hero for a community that really needs it. And so again, not this community, not this hero that's going to save the world from an alien invasion or something, but to really give back to his own community. And again, there's a cool clip here. It's not captioned. I was able to get captioned, so I apologize for that. But it kind of mirrors kind of the experience that some Black males experience.
Dispatch, car 7705, citing possible drunk, should we engage?
Is it our suspect?
We have a Black male that need verification.
Good morning. Is there a problem?
No, you tell me. What's your name, son?
I'm just taking a walk. Minding my business.
I need to see some ID.
To walk?
Turn around, take down your hoodie.
May I ask why?
Because I said so. Shit. It is him.
On the ground, now! Hands behind your back! Get on the ground, now!
I'm really sorry, guys.
You're under arrest.
So again, kind of this idea of what would it mean to have bulletproof skin, to not have to worry, about the violence that comes from the police community or from police brutality. What kind of differences could you make? And here's a hero that has that ability and is trying to make a difference. And so I think that's pretty powerful. We think about kind of our heroes in the communities that we in, if our heroes reflect our communities and reflect the people that we look up to or that we have common interactions with. I also wanted to highlight some stories or some things from She-Hulk as well too. So She-Hulk was originally created by Stan Lee and John Buscema. So actually the only reason that She-Hulk was initially created was so they could retain rights to this character. And so in 1978, the Hulk TV show was on, it was really popular. And so if they ever introduced like a woman Hulk on the TV show, then that TV show and that company that was broadcasting got to own the rights for that character. And so Stan Lee was like, no, we didn't make sure we own the rights to a female Hulk. And so that's the only reason they initially created She-Hulk. However, as time went on, became a very fleshed out, well thought out character. Was a highly idealistic lawyer with the history of defending civil rights, including villains' rights for due process, which I think is pretty awesome to think about. This is a person who is a superhero, fights villains, but still cares about their due process, still cares about making sure that they still get their rights. Was also one of the first heroes to consistently break the fourth wall. I know a lot of times Deadpool was kind of thought of as like the hero that breaks the fourth wall, but it was actually She-Hulk was actually one of the first characters to do this on a consistent basis. One of the things I really want to highlight is kind of just the way that her television show kind of came under fire for being what's considered overtly feminist. And there was a lot of, especially on the internet, just a lot of hate coming onto this television as kind of be considered woke or feminist, or that it was just trash TV. If you do a YouTube search for She-Hulk, you'll find a lot of things that say like She-Hulk, end of Marvel, or She-Hulk is a mess, things like that. And what I think is hilarious is that the show called this, like the show knew that this was going to happen in some ways. And so what I love is that this is this was a Instagram post from when She-Hulk was first announced as a television show. And so, some of the things that are said here, right? So we have a Me Too movement and now all the male heroes and gone. Somehow I think Marvel just made a wrong turn. Why everything in Marvel got to be female now? Why everything got to be about women? Who that cares about women's right? Hulk doesn't need to be a girl. Chill with the females, Marvel, Jesus. And in the show, it reflected that same sentiment. And so we have a Me Too movement. Now all the male heroes are gone. Why everything got to be female now? Why are you turning every superhero into a girl? And so in the show, She-Hulk, she becomes very popular. She gets her powers and kind of becomes a little bit of a media sensation. And so there's all this backlash against her saying that, oh, why do we have female heroes? Why do we need this? And it's just funny to think that it happened in real life and the TV show reflected that. I think one of the things too is that one of the main villains in the show was this group called Intelligentsia, which was kind of this internet group. And if we think about kind of the way that certain internet cultures can be very misogynistic, it really reflects that as the villain, not so much as like, oh, here's this bad guy that She-Hulk needs to punch out, or here's this alien that She-Hulk needs to punch out. No, it's this basically she's fighting against misogyny in some ways. And again, there was so much hate and so much animosity towards this idea. Yet the people online complaining was again reflected in the TV show, which I thought was just kind of really smart on the creators to kind of be on top of that. And so they knew they were going to get a lot of backlash on the internet from a lot of keyboard warriors. And so that's kind of what this show's villain was. And so it almost kind of gives, when I think about that, it almost reminds you of kind of like the controversy and the issues regarding Andrew Tate, who is this kind of social media person that really talks about misogyny and treating women as objects and things like that. And here's this community in She-Hulk that kind of also reflects that, this idea that She-Hulk is not somebody that should be a hero and that there's things wrong with her and that why does everything have to be female now? And so really pushing back on this idea of the male dominance in the superhero genre. And I have this video, but due to time, I'm just going to go ahead and skip the video. So I also want to highlight the characters of Daredevil and Echo. And so, Daredevil was created by Stan Lee and artist Bill Everett. And what's really cool about Daredevil is he's a blind superhero. And his blindness is really what gives him his strength and his powers. What's interesting is that in the Marvel universe, they have magic, they have super science, yet Matt Murdock still chooses to stay blind. And so, he sees his blindness as his strength. And I think that speaks a lot to kind of when we think about abilities, disabilities, people who identify with having, with being temporarily able-bodied, temporarily unable-bodied, and things like that. And so kind of speaks to the strength of that, to be able to say, I am a blind superhero, that's who I am, and that's what gives me my powers. And I think that's kind of in a lot of ways really empowering and really cool to see that. Another character is Echo, who was created by David Mack and artist Joe Quesada. And she is so her name is Maya Lopez, and she is from the Cheyenne Nation and is completely deaf with a capital D, meaning she was born deaf. She's an Olympic athlete who possesses something called photographic reflexes. And I love this panel right here because this is a character who's talking to Echo. And what's really interesting is that the character is signing to Echo. Now Echo can read lips, but because this character has a face mask as part of their powers, they still have to sign. And so it's really interesting. So like Hazmat's using sign language. Of course, Echo can't read her lips with the mask on. And so I think that's actually pretty cool to see that in a comic book, to actually kind of see that kind of showing up. Oops. And so I also wanted to touch on Ms. Marvel. And so this was a creation by Sana Amat, G. Willow Wilson, Adrienne Alfona, Jamie McLevely, and Jean Colvin. And so this was a character specifically created as a teenage Pakistani Muslim girl. The series really kind of explores her conflicts with both supervillains, but also explores the conflicts of being home and religious students. It really kind of serves as a window into the American Muslim experience and normalizes the idea of what it means to be Muslim and American at the same time. And so there's some really cool comic book panels that you wouldn't necessarily see in other comic book stories. Here they are in a mask, kind of just hanging out and talking about things. There's a really cool video that kind of highlights too, as well from the Ms. Marvel TV show, some of the kind of traditions and things that are common in the community.
Pakistani and Muslim and from New Jersey, so I thought it'd be really cool if I do some cool cultural details and Easter eggs in Miss Marvel. Spoilers in 1, 2, 3. The scene starts off with Amr doing dua. This is the part of the prayer where you actually ask God for stuff. Also, what I love about the scene is ripped straight from the comics. Then we see Kamala's dad reciting some shairi in English. This is a reference to Urdu being a very poetic language, and a lot of the poetry in South Asia is written in Urdu. I love this scene because there's so many times I've had a Bollywood song in my car and a white person gets in and I'm like, oh shit. Right before her car test, she says Bismillah, which means in the name of God. It doesn't matter how religious you are, if you're Muslim, you say this before any exam. In this scene right here, Kamala's mom calls him a kamina, which basically means scoundrel, and then she proceeds to guilt trip her, which is something Desi moms are very famous for. In this hallway scene, you hear a really cool song called Deal With It by MC Riz. If that name sounds familiar, it should, because that is the stage name of Oscar-winning actor Riz Ahmed. Well, that's it for part 1. Let me know if you want me to keep doing these.
So again, you see his character who's giving us a window in what this community is like. And again, when we think about our heroes, we typically have, our Captain Americas or Iron Man, who are, white males. And here we have a hero that's specifically highlighting this, a really specific cultural experience, while at the same time still being a hero, which I think is pretty awesome. So I also kind of wanted to spend some time to also highlight Green Lantern, Green Arrow. And so this was kind of a limited run series that happened in the 70s, and it really kind of served as a deconstruction of the superhero genre. And the reason I'm highlighting it is because this is one of those comics that really brought social issues to the forefront. It was one of the first comics to really do that purposefully. And so in many ways, you have Green Arrow, who is, well, Green Lantern, who's basically a police cop or a space cop. And so Green Lantern, he's part of this Green Lantern Corps. His job is to fight, outer space bad guys, things like that, and protect his sector, which includes Earth. Green Arrow, more of a street hero, more of a person that's going to fight for the common person, if that makes sense. And to kind of pair them up was kind of a way to be a foil to Green Lantern and his more kind of traditional type of roles or views, excuse me. And it really, the comic book series really asked what it meant to be a hero in the face of inequity and racism. And so I love these panels because, here you have Green Lantern and Green Arrow talking about something. And previously Green Lantern had rounded up this person who we saw as as a troublemaker or something, right? And so he goes, the lady here is the grandmother of the kid you sent to headquarters. She's 80 and he's her only means of support. Mike had to drop out of school and get a crummy job because she has no one else. That's tough, but blast it, he was breaking the law. Technically he was, sure. He lost his temper and roughed up the fat cat landlord who owns this dump and the creep who hasn't spent a cent for repairs in years. Now he figures he can make more money using the property for a parking lot. So he's going to evict the tenants. Kick a lot of old folks out in the street. Lord knows this building is bad, but they don't have anything else. What have you seen? What have you seen? Listen, I hope you've enjoyed playing superhero out there. I hope it did a lot of good for your ego. Easy, you've got no cause to tell at me. I have a job, I do it. Seems I've heard that before at the Nazi war trials. And then somebody off panel goes, I want to ask the ring slinger a question, Mr. Green Arrow. So he goes, I've been reading about how you work for the blue skins and how on planet someplace you helped out the orange skins and how you did considerable for the purple skins. Well, there's skins you never bothered with, the black skins. I want to know, how come? Answer me that, Mr. Green Lantern. And he says, I can't. And so I love this because it's really speaking to this idea of what are superheroes doing for common problems? What are superheroes doing for racism, oppression, discrimination, prejudice? What is the superhero kind of stance on that? And here's Green Arrow talking to Green Lantern saying hey, you play hide and mighty over there in outer space, but what are you doing for the people down here that might really need it? And so I love this because it just really kind of, like I said, deconstructs kind of the superhero genre in some way to think about what would it mean for somebody with these fantastic powers to actually do something for the people that might need it the most. And then lastly, I kind of want to highlight my favorite superhero, Spider-Man. And so Peter Parker, Spider-Man was created by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko. And he was actually one of the first heroes to actually have real world problems and really represented this kind of middle to lower class experience. He was a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. He was a hero, again, for the neighborhood, somebody that would help out regular folk. And so he grew up in a non-traditional household raised by his uncle and aunt. Excuse me. Later on, there was a creation of Miles Morales by Brian Michael Bendis and Sarah Pichelli. And so they were inspired by the then upcoming election of President Obama and actor, comedian, rapper Donald Glover. And so the idea was to reflect the diversity of New York City and represent both the Black and Puerto Rican community. And so, again, this is a character, Peter Parker, who at the time was not a traditional character. He was his own sidekick in some ways. He was coming from a middle-class family. He had real problems. He had to pay the rent. He had to worry about his aunt being sick. You know, he had class he had to go to, tests, things like that. Stuff that was never seen in the superhero genre, and really spoke to more of a everyday blue-collar type of experience. Later on, Miles Morales came to kind of speak about more what it means to be those things, but also coming from a BIPOC background. There's a really great video about kind of like Spider-Man in general, and one of the reasons why maybe he appeals to so many.
You know, one of the greatest things about Spider-Man's outfit, his costume? What? He is completely covered. So any kid could imagine he's Spider-Man because no color of the skin shows. He could be black under that. He could be red. He could be yellow. He could belong to any race. And that wasn't done purposely. It was done accidentally. But I think it was the best thing we did, making him so that he could be anybody under that costume.
And then really quickly, just wanted to highlight too as well that, like, I love one of the things that,
you know,
Trouble's here. You know, Miles Morales, he kind of talks about this idea of like, you know, he talks about being, yes, I am Black, and yes, I'm also Hispanic, is what he says. And, you know, yes, that's important to him, but at the same time, he also wants to be Spider-Man. He doesn't want to be known just as the Black Spider-Man or the person of color Spider-Man. He wants to be Spider-Man without also giving up who he is at the same time. And so it kind of really speaks to some of the experiences sometimes BIPOC folk have, right? This idea of, yes, I want to be this person and this is who I am, but that's not the only thing that defines me. It is a part of who I am, and that's how I express myself, but don't put the label on me as like the Black this or the Latino this, right? Like, I want that to be a part of who I am and how I express myself, but don't tokenize me in that way. And so, you know, he's not just the Black Spider-Man, he is Spider-Man. And that's something that's really important to him as a character. And that's it. So I provide some readings there, a couple comic books that you can read if you want to get a little bit more backstory. But we have a few minutes, I think, for questions, and I'll do my best to try to answer.
Hello, and thank you so much for your expertise and the information you were able to provide, Emmanuel. I really enjoyed the connections that you make to pop culture and how sometimes unintentionally or intentionally it's speaking to a broader meaning, a broader influence. So it was really interesting to see those connections made. And just thank you for your work and thank you for sharing it with us. One of the questions that we received in the question Q&A box is from Matthew Admonson. They ask they state, it's an interesting note about Wonder Woman's creator being in a poly relationship. How, if at all, did this part of his life make its way into those comics?
Yeah, no, great question. So, you know, unfortunately, I can't really speak to, you know, the polyamorous portion of his life directly making an impact, but in terms of the creator, he talks a lot about the women in his life and how they influenced the creation of Wonder Woman, specifically when we think about Wonder Woman as being both kind of a warrior and a diplomat. And so when he talks about his relationships, and there's not a lot on it, but it exists. But I think kind of him mentioning that, you know, he drew a lot of the type of strength and from, you know, their life partner, and he drew a lot of kind of, I think, that type of diplomacy, you know, type of ideals from his wife. And so I think those things are the things that really inspired him to kind of create Wonder Woman. Again, it's hard for me to specifically say, I'm not an avid Wonder Woman reader. I wish I could go in there and say like, oh yeah, this is when it happens, or this, you'll see this, right? But you see a lot of kind of the character herself being kind of reflected by the people that surrounded him, if that makes sense.
Thank you for that. Our next question comes from Lakia Green. They state, Marvel is often referred to as the humans trying to be gods genre, while DC Comics are more known for gods trying to be humans themes. Do you see any parallels for the BIPOC community in DC Comics? And how do you think that independent comics overall explore these themes?
Yeah, great question. Wow, I'm already thinking how to answer these ones, right?
Right?
Oh, my goodness. No, I appreciate it. I appreciate it. Now it's something for me to think about later on. So no, I love that idea. There's always been the idea, right, that DC is like, oh, they're the gods trying to be human, and Marvel are humans trying to be gods, right? And so I'm going to be very honest. I'm more of a Marvel guy. I've always been a Marvel guy since I was like, 10 years old. Marvel's always kind of been my thing. Make mine Marvel is the expression, is how it goes. But in the DC world, I think there are some opportunities for that. I think a lot about Blue Beetle. It's gonna kill me. I'm gonna get roasted for not knowing his name. I'm gonna say Jaime Reyes. But some of the comics that I have read about him kind of reflect what it's like to be in a Latino household, which I thought was really cool. I have an older brother who's a big fan of his, and he was, sending me some stuff about what it's like to read a comic book that expresses the life that you've lived, which I think is actually pretty powerful. And like I said, I've read a couple clips, or I've read a couple sections for some of those comic books, and they do a pretty good job of kind of representing what it's like to grow up in a Latino household, which I thought was pretty cool. But again, it's really hard for me to say in the DC universe, because again, my interests lie more in the Marvel universe than they have in the DC universe. And in terms of independent, there's a lot of cool stuff happening in independent comics. I've been out of the comic book scene for a while. Unfortunately, there was a time when I would frequently go to the comic book shop and try to keep up with what's going on. And so I'm a little out of it, but there's this great, I don't know if it wrapped up, but there's this great comic book called Bitch Planet. And it's going to bother me who the artist is or who the writer is, but it's this amazing kind of like story about these women that are put on a penal colony in outer space, and kind of just like the idea of what that's like. And it takes place in the future, in which kind of a little bit of a Stepford Wives type of future, also interlocked with what's that show? It's gonna bother me, where the women wear red and have the white. Anyway, it takes place in a gonna bother me, but it takes place in a future that's similar to that. And so women who don't conform to what a woman's supposed to be are sent to this penal colony. And there's just some really cool stuff that's happening in that comic book series. It's called Bitch Planet. I love it. I don't know if it actually wrapped up as a series, but there's some really cool stuff happening. Handmaid's Tale, thank you. That's what it was.
Yeah.
That's what it was. And so really cool stuff. I would definitely recommend for y'all to check that out if you can.
Okay. Okay, so I think we have time for one more question. And let's see. Remember that conversation we had before this started? Emmanuel, it's happening. So, are there statements, this comes from Anita Malone. Are there statements or idea you use to combat the anti-BIPOC views coming from people not wanting things like a Black Spider-Man or a Black Little Mermaid? Are there like go-to state? I think what this question is asking is, are there go-to statements that you use to kind of stand up to that and kind of combat?
That's a great question. I don't know if there are statements directly that I fall back on. For me, it's always kind of a question of why, asking someone why they kind of think about those things, or why, what is your problem? And, I'm going to be very honest, I remember, I think I was like, I don't remember, it was like when one of the Fantastic Four movies came back and they changed the race of Johnny Storm. And I remember being a little annoyed by it. But then, one of the things I realized too is just being like, there are some characters who their BIPOC background is central to that character, and there's some that are not. And so when we think about Johnny Storm in the Fantastic Four, he's a white male. And so him being a white male does not impact the story in really any way per se. And so that's why I think a gender, like either a race swap or whatever they call it, is there's nothing wrong with that, I think, per se. Whereas if you have characters where being a person of color, being BIPOC is central to who they are, then that doesn't make a lot of sense, right? It's like, let me go to Daredevil. It'd be like taking Daredevil and not making him blind anymore. And it's like, well, that's kind of like a big part of his character. Like that doesn't work like that. So, I think a lot about that, when I think about kind of this idea of bringing more characters of color into our, into these type of stories, right? Whether it be the Black Little Mermaid, again, because who they are in terms of their skin color and things like that is not a central component of the character. So why should that matter?
Perfect. Okay, one more question. Do you mind one more question?
Yes, please. I have time.
Okay. What is your reaction to the portrayal of Namor in Wakanda Forever? That comes from Drea Letamendi.
Yeah. So I was like, so I was fully like, it's some like, I just can't put in words how much it made me feel like about how awesome it was to see somebody who kind of looked like people I know on the screen like that. And there's a scene where they're actually going into, and I'm blanking already on the name, but like when they're going there and you see a lot of kind of Latin American imagery, things like that. And it was just really cool. And, you know, I remember just being in theater opening night, you know, just really wide-eyed and, you know, almost shed a tear maybe, I don't know, but there was something really powerful about seeing that and just being kind of like, you know, seeing kind of people that look like me on the screen and seeing people that, you know, family members and friends that look like me on the screen. And that to me was just like, holy crap, this is, you know, and there's this, this kind of expression like, oh, this is what white people feel like all the time? Like, is this how they feel? Like, is this every day for them? Like, holy crap, no wonder y'all are chilling. Like,
right?
So it's kind of like, you know, that's amazing to be able to see that on the screen, you know. As time's gone on, I've kind of examined it a little bit. You know, there is, you know, I love it. I'm still, you know, and I have a little Funko Pop over here in my office of Namor. You know, but I've also thought about too, like in terms of, you know, how this is also bringing in some indigenous type of things as well too, and celebrating like what does it mean to be Latino, but also what does it mean to be indigenous, and is there some overlap there or isn't there? And I think a lot about kind of like this idea of, I'm thinking of the word right now, it's kind of like taking kind of indigenous customs and culture and bringing it into your culture and stuff like that. I don't know why I can't think of it right now. So,
Appropriation?
Appropriation, thank you. So appropriation of indigenous community of Central America and making that kind of the de facto Latino type of identity. And so there's some, you know, contention there that I've also been thinking a lot about too as well, and thinking about how does that fit. So that's another conversation, though, I think.
Yeah, that's a whole other presentation, but we'll be happy to host it, Boo. So again, Emmanuel, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this presentation, as I'm sure a lot of us have, based upon what the feedback that we're getting in the chat box. So thank you all for attending. We hope to see you again on March 8th, and have a good rest of your weekend, or week, and going into your weekend. I'm sorry, your week. Have a good rest of your week. We're only on Wednesday. We're gonna make it though. So thank you all very much and have a good day.